Fact 1. The father of computer science spent the war cracking Nazi codes. In 1940, the Germans believed their Enigma machine had made communication absolutely secure. They had mathematical reason for confidence. Each keystroke triggered cascading substitutions through multiple rotors with 26 possible positions each. The permutations exceeded 150 million possible combinations. Cracking a single message through trial and error would take longer than the age of the universe. And the Germans changed settings daily at midnight, meaning, even if you broke today's code, tomorrow you'd start from zero. The cipher rendered messages indecipherable to nearly every Allied codebreaker. Nearly every. Alan Turing, a 28-year-old British mathematician and scientist, arrived at Bletchley Park in September 1939 with a radical idea. Instead of attacking the code conventionally, he would build a machine to think for him. Working with a team of cryptanalysts, Turing designed and constructed the bomb, a computing machine specifically engineered to decipher Enigma codes. Completed in March 1940, it stood over 6 feet tall, weighed more than a ton, and contained 108 rotating drums wired with miles of electrical connections. The breakthrough wasn't just mechanical, it was philosophical. Turing realized that even theoretically unbreakable codes contained patterns, tiny statistical fingerprints left by human operators. German messages often began with predictable phrases: weather forecasts, routine reports, standard military formalities. These cribs gave the bomb starting points to systematically attack the cipher. By 1943, Bletchley Park was decrypting over 3,000 German messages daily. Thanks to the breakthroughs of Turing and his colleagues, the British were able to decode encrypted Nazi messages in less than an hour, a development that changed the course of the war. The intelligence harvest was staggering. U-boat positions allowing convoy reroutings around wolf packs, Luftwaffe bombing targets enabling civilian evacuations hours before raids, Panzer Division movements giving Allied commanders decisive advantages. General Eisenhower would later estimate that Turing's code-breaking work shortened the war by at least 2 years, potentially saving 14 million lives. But here's what makes Turing's achievement transcendent. He wasn't just breaking Nazi codes, he was inventing the mathematical framework for modern computer science. Every algorithm, every program, every computer you've ever used traces its conceptual lineage back to Turing's wartime work. Yet for decades, his contributions remained classified. The British government enforced absolute secrecy about Bletchley Park until the 1970s. Turing himself died in 1954 under tragic circumstances, chemically castrated by the government he'd saved, prosecuted for homosexuality in an era that criminalized his existence. Britain finally issued a posthumous royal pardon in 2013. By then, Turing had been dead for 59 years, denied recognition for engineering the victory that saved his nation. The father of computer science spent the war teaching machines to think. He used that thinking to defeat Nazism. And history almost forgot him entirely. Fact 2. Indigenous volunteers defended the coast of Alaska from invasion. June 7, 1942. Attu Island, Alaska. A wall of fog rolled across the shore as Japanese troops landed. American spotters couldn't even see the ships until boots hit the beach. For the first time since the War of 1812, enemy soldiers stood on American soil. Most Americans today don't even know this happened. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded the Aleutian Islands, a remote arm of Alaska, stretching deep into the North Pacific. Their goal: establish forward bases for bombing mainland Alaska and sever the Lend-Lease route that ferried vital supplies to the Soviet Union. Defending that frontier seemed impossible. The Aleutians spanned over 1,200 miles of frozen archipelago larger than California. No GPS, no roads, winds that shredded tents, temperatures that plunged to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, fog so dense it could swallow entire aircraft for days. So, the U.S. military turned to those who already knew how to survive there: Alaska's indigenous people. They became the Alaska Territorial Guard, hunters, trappers, and fishermen from the Yupik, Inupiaq, Tlingit, Aleut, and Tsimshian nations. Nearly 6,000 volunteers joined. They didn't need maps. They read the wind, the stars, and the ice. They knew every inlet and hidden pass, every rhythm of the tides. Operating in tiny teams of 3 to 5, they established lookout posts across thousands of miles of coastline. They spotted enemy ships, reported weather for U.S. aircraft, guided convoys through lethal storms, rescued downed pilots from terrain no search party could reach. It wasn't just defense, it was endurance measured in frostbite and faith. Private John Pingayak, a Yupik scout, once mushed his dog sled 90 miles through a blizzard to deliver intelligence on Japanese submarine movements, guided only by moonlight and memory. His message saved an American supply convoy from ambush. Yet, while they defended America's frontier, their own people suffered behind barbed wire. When Japan occupied Attu and Kiska, the U.S. military forcibly relocated Aleutian villagers for their safety. Many died in overcrowded camps of disease and hunger. Indigenous soldiers fought for freedom, while their families were prisoners of the nation they served. When the war ended, the Territorial Guard vanished from memory. No GI Bill, no veteran benefits, no honors, only silence. It wasn't until 2000 that surviving members finally received official discharge papers 58 years late. And in 2010, Congress awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal. By then, almost all were gone. They guarded a country that barely recognized them. They protected land that had been theirs long before it was called America. And history nearly forgot them. Fact 3. A unit of black truck drivers played a crucial role after D-Day. August 25, 1944, St. Lo, France. Private Willie F. Jarman climbed into his GMC Deuce and a Half and checked his manifest 5 tons of artillery shells bound for Chartres, 180 miles east. He'd already been driving 16 hours. His shift had 8 more to go. Behind him, another truck pulled into line. Then another. Then 65 more, a convoy stretching 2 miles across the French countryside. At 0600, the engines roared to life. Headlights cut through the mist. Every 5 minutes, another convoy rolled out. And for 82 straight days, they never stopped. They called it the Red Ball Express, and 3/4 of its drivers were African-American soldiers serving in a segregated army. After D-Day, Patton's Third Army raced east across France, faster than logistics could keep up. His tanks devoured 400,000 gallons of fuel a day. Artillery fired 500,000 shells each week. The railways were bombed. The bridges gone. Supplies piled up on the Normandy beaches with no way forward. So the Allies built a miracle on wheels, 2 one-way highways reserved for trucks alone. Eastbound carried supplies. Westbound returned empty. Nothing else moved on those roads. Nearly 6,000 trucks ran day and night. Mechanics rode with them, fixing breakdowns on the move. Military police cleared slower vehicles to keep the lifeline flowing. The scale was staggering: 12,500 tons delivered every day. 412,000 tons over 82 days. 122 million ton-miles traveled. The Red Ball Express burned more fuel-delivering supplies than entire German armies used to fight. And yet, it was driven mostly by men who couldn't eat in the same mess halls as the soldiers they supplied. The irony was sharp. Black drivers feeding the war against fascism while facing segregation from their own nation. When trucks broke down and 30% did daily black mechanics, repaired them with scrap wire, wrenches, and ingenuity that kept the Allied advance alive. When German aircraft attacked, they kept driving. When exhaustion claimed drivers after 40 hours at the wheel, others took their place without complaint. General Eisenhower visited the convoys and watched weary men still behind the wheel. He said quietly, "These men are winning the war, as surely as any infantry." The Red Ball Express shortened the war by up to 6 months. It proved that courage has no color, and that wars aren't only won by those who fire, but by those who keep moving forward. They didn't fight for medals or recognition. They fought for victory and delivered it. Fact 4. The U.S. military was full of baseball legends. Fenway Park, Boston, April 30th, 1941. Opening day. A young Ted Williams stepped into the batter's box for his second season with the Red Sox. At just 22, he was already being called the greatest pure hitter the game had ever seen. That year, he hit .406, a record no player has touched since. 3 years later, he wasn't holding a bat. He was gripping the controls of a fighter jet. When America entered World War II, even the nation's heroes traded stadium cheers for military orders. President Roosevelt's green light letter encouraged baseball to continue for public morale, but it never told players not to serve. Over 500 major leaguers enlisted or were drafted. Half of all rosters disappeared into uniform. Names every fan knew: Joe DiMaggio, Hank Greenberg, Jackie Robinson, and Ted Williams swapped baseball caps for helmets. DiMaggio, fresh off his 56-game hitting streak, spent 3 years in the Army Air Forces. Greenberg, already a superstar, was drafted before Pearl Harbor released briefly, then re-enlisted 2 days after the attack. Jackie Robinson, still years from breaking baseball's color line, became a second lieutenant in a segregated army. When he refused to move to the back of a military bus, he was court-martialed and won. That stand would foreshadow what came in 1947. And then, Ted Williams, the man whose swing seemed divine. He enlisted in 1942, trained as a Marine pilot, and was soon teaching others how to fly. His instructors said he had the best reflexes they'd ever seen. He spent the war training pilots frustrated that he never saw combat. Then came Korea. At 33, Williams was recalled to active duty and flew 39 combat missions in F-9F Panther jets. On one flight, his plane caught fire mid-air. He kept flying until he reached friendly lines, ejecting seconds before the jet exploded. His wingman? Future astronaut John Glenn. Williams returned home in 1953, 5 seasons lost to war. Yet he still finished with 521 home runs and a lifetime batting average of .344. They could have stayed home. They didn't. They traded fame for duty, comfort for risk, wealth for $75 a month pay. It was the last time in America's history that privilege didn't mean exemption when the famous stood shoulder to shoulder with the forgotten. Baseball's greatest generation lost their prime years to war, and none of them ever complained. Fact 5. A Hollywood icon invented a torpedo guidance system. Hollywood, California, December 10, 1941. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Hedy Lamarr sat in her Bel Air home reading headlines about German U-boats sinking Allied ships. To the world, she was Hollywood's most glamorous actress, the most beautiful woman in the world. But that night, she wasn't thinking about fame. She was thinking about torpedoes. Radio-controlled torpedoes were the future of naval warfare, fast, deadly, and precise. But they had one fatal weakness. The control signals could be jammed. A single burst of enemy interference could send $1 million weapon spinning off course. Most actresses would have turned the page. Hedy Lamarr wasn't most actresses. Born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna in 1914, she had grown up surrounded by music and mathematics, her father a banker, her mother a pianist. Her first husband, Friedrich Mandl, was an Austrian arms dealer, controlling, abusive. He forbade her to speak at the lavish dinner parties he hosted for generals and engineers, but he couldn't stop her from listening. And she listened to everything. Discussions of radio guidance, frequency control, and munitions design. In 1937, she escaped that marriage by disguising herself as a maid and fleeing to London. Within a year, she was in Hollywood, under contract with MGM, earning $4,000 a week and dazzling audiences on screen. But when war broke out, Lamarr decided beauty wasn't enough. She wanted to fight back with her mind. Her collaborator was George Antheil, an avant-garde composer and mechanical genius. Together, they developed a bold new idea: frequency hopping. The concept was simple and revolutionary. What if a torpedo and its controller switched radio frequencies in perfect unison, dozens of times a second? Enemy ships could no longer jam the signal. The connection would be unbreakable. To synchronize those jumps, Lamarr and Antheil used a system inspired by player piano's paper rolls that changed frequencies automatically in both transmitter and torpedo. On June 10, 1942, they received U.S. patent 2,292,387 for their secret communication system. The Navy dismissed it. Too complex, too fragile, and perhaps too unthinkable that a woman, an actress, could have out-engineered their experts. The idea went nowhere. The patent sat forgotten. Hedy Lamarr went back to Hollywood, but her invention didn't die. In the 1960s, engineers rediscovered the principle. By the 1980s, frequency hopping had become the backbone of secure communication systems, and later, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Every time your phone connects wirelessly, every time your headphones pair, every time a satellite sends a signal, you're using Hedy Lamarr's idea. Recognition came too late. In 1997, she received the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Pioneer Award, speaking by phone because she was too frail to attend. In 2014, she was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame 14 years after her death. For 60 years, the world saw only her face and ignored her mind. But in the invisible frequencies that connect our world, her legacy hums on. Every signal, every connection, every wireless heartbeat carries a trace of her genius. Remember her name, Hedy Lamarr, the actress who invented Wi-Fi. Fact 6. The U.S. government established an entire town to build the atomic bomb. September 1942. East Tennessee wilderness. Near a quiet community called Oak Ridge, the U.S. government began buying up 60,000 acres of farmland. Families who had lived there for generations received notices. Evacuate within weeks. No explanation. No negotiation. Eminent domain backed by armed guards if necessary. By November, the bulldozers came. By winter, forests vanished beneath steel and concrete. And by February 1943, a city had appeared on land that officially didn't exist. This was Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the most secret city in America. It was part of the Manhattan Project, the Allied effort to build the atomic bomb. While Los Alamos designed the weapon and Hanford produced plutonium, Oak Ridge had one mission: enrich uranium-235, the rare isotope needed for a nuclear explosion. The scale was staggering. At its peak, Oak Ridge employed 82,000 workers and consumed more electricity than New York City. 4 major facilities dominated the valley. K-25, a gaseous diffusion plant, 2 million square feet of industrial maze. Y-12, an electromagnetic separation facility powered by massive magnets. S-50, a thermal diffusion plant. X-10, a nuclear reactor producing plutonium. But here's the extraordinary part: almost no one knew what they were building. The Manhattan Project ran on absolute secrecy. Workers were trained for narrow tasks: adjust this dial, monitor that gauge, record the numbers, and never ask why. 18-year-old Gladys Owens worked as a Calitron operator at Y-12. She later said, "For 2 years, I sat in front of a control panel, keeping needles steady. When they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, that's when I learned what I'd been doing." Thousands of young women, many barely out of high school, kept the project running. Their letters were censored, their phone calls monitored. Even married couples couldn't discuss their jobs. Signs everywhere reminded them, "What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, let it stay here." And yet Oak Ridge was a city with schools, churches, theaters, grocery stores, even bowling alleys. Children played in fenced yards under guard towers. By July 1945, Oak Ridge had produced 50 kilograms of uranium-235, enough for Little Boy. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The next morning, the local newspaper headline read, "Oak Ridge attacks Japan." Only then did workers realize what their labor had created. Some felt pride, some felt guilt, most felt both. Gladys Owens said later, "When I understood, I cried. Then I felt proud. Then I felt sick." In 3 years, the United States had turned farmland into a hidden city, secrecy into science, and science into destruction. 82,000 people built the atomic bomb without knowing they were building it. Fact 7. The United States was involved in the war even before Pearl Harbor. September 2, 1940. Washington, D.C. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, transferring 50 aging U.S. destroyers to Britain in exchange for base rights across the Atlantic. It was an act of defiance, and it broke every rule of neutrality. America wasn't at war. Congress hadn't approved it. The law was murky at best. But Roosevelt didn't care. Britain was dying, and he knew it. By the fall of 1940, Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe. France, Belgium, Norway, Poland, all gone. The Luftwaffe was firebombing London nightly. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be built. Britain stood alone, one breath away from collapse. 80% of Americans wanted no part of Europe's war. Isolationist rallies filled stadiums. Roosevelt quietly chose a different path. The Destroyers for Bases deal was only the beginning. In March 1941, he pushed through the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the U.S. to lend weapons, vehicles, fuel, and food to nations vital to American defense. In practice, it meant America would arm the Allies without firing a shot. The scale was staggering: 17,500 aircraft, 3,000 tanks, and 360,000 trucks to Britain. 14,000 aircraft, and 7,000 tanks to the Soviet Union. 4 million tons of food, 2 million tons of fuel, 15 million pairs of boots. It wasn't neutrality. It was America becoming the arsenal of democracy. By mid-1941, the Atlantic had become an undeclared war zone. German U-boats began attacking U.S. merchant ships carrying Lend-Lease supplies. Roosevelt ordered the Navy to escort convoys and shoot on sight. In September, the USS Greer was fired upon. In October, the USS Kearney was torpedoed, 11 sailors killed. Weeks later, the USS Reuben James was sunk, killing 115 men over a month before Pearl Harbor. America was already bleeding, just not officially at war. Then came December 7, 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. Neutrality was over, but those secret years had bought time. Without Roosevelt's defiance, Britain might have fallen. Without Lend-Lease, the Soviet Union might have collapsed. Without that lifeline, there may never have been a D-Day. Churchill later called it the most unsordid act in history. And perhaps it was. Roosevelt broke the rules of democracy to save democracy itself. It's not a comfortable truth, but it is an honest one. Fact 8. China and Japan never signed a peace treaty with each other. August 15, 1945. Tokyo Bay. Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people for the first time in history. Japan had surrendered. The deadliest war humanity had ever known was over. Except it wasn't. Not for China. While the world celebrated peace, China and Japan never signed a treaty to end their war. 79 years later, they still haven't. It isn't a formality, it's a wound that never closed. China had been fighting Japan since 1937, long before Pearl Harbor. The clash at the Marco Polo Bridge ignited a brutal 8-year invasion. Japanese forces swept across China, leaving devastation behind. The rape of Nanking alone killed 300,000 civilians in 6 weeks. Over 14 million Chinese died during the war, more than any nation except the Soviet Union. Chinese resistance tied down 1 million Japanese soldiers' troops who could never face the Americans in the Pacific. Their sacrifice helped the Allies win, yet their story remains almost forgotten. When Japan surrendered in 1945, China's civil war reignited instantly. Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists turned on each other. By 1949, Mao ruled the mainland while Chiang fled to Taiwan. Both claimed to be the real China, leaving Japan with no one to make peace with. In 1952, Japan signed the Treaty of San Francisco with 48 nations. China wasn't invited. Taiwan later signed its own pact, but Beijing never did. When Japan and China normalized relations in 1972, they still skipped a formal peace treaty. That silence lingers. Reparations unresolved. Apologies disputed. Borders contested. The war that killed over 14 million Chinese never truly ended. It just went quiet. And that quiet still echoes across every headline, every tension, and every fragile peace in East Asia today. Fact 9. Early NASA rockets were based on Nazi missile designs. July 20th, 1969. The Moon. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Watching from mission control was Wernher von Braun, the man who built the rocket that took him there, and a former SS officer who once built weapons for Nazi Germany. The Saturn V that carried astronauts to the moon was the descendant of the V-2 rocket that devastated Europe. During World War II, von Braun led Germany's secret rocket program At Peenemünde, his creation, fueled by liquid oxygen and ethanol, flew faster than sound and struck without warning. Between 1944 and 1945, more than 3,000 V-2s rained down on London and Antwerp, killing about 9,000 civilians. The greater horror lay underground. The rockets were built by slaves at the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Some 20,000 prisoners died from starvation, disease, and execution while producing the missiles. Von Braun visited the tunnels. He saw the conditions. He kept working. When Germany collapsed, he gathered his team and surrendered to U.S. forces, ensuring capture by America, not the Soviets. Washington quietly launched Operation Paperclip, importing more than 1,600 German engineers and scientists, many with Nazi ties. Their records were cleaned. Their expertise was priceless. In the United States, von Braun became the face of the space age. He charmed the media, appeared on Disney programs, and spoke of humanity's destiny among the stars. As head of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, he designed the Saturn V, a machine 36 stories tall, capable of lifting 100,000 pounds into orbit. That same technology, once used to bomb cities, now carried humanity to another world. Von Braun received the National Medal of Science and died in 1977 as an American hero. But the moral shadow never lifted. Should a nation built on liberty have forgiven a man who profited from slave labor? Did the moon landing justify the means that made it possible? Can scientific genius ever be separated from the suffering that produced it? Every image of the moon landing carries that contradiction, a triumph of imagination born from the machinery of terror. The Apollo program said, "We came in peace for all mankind." But its rockets came from war. And that is a truth history must never forget. 9 facts. 9 moments when World War II revealed truths that textbooks rarely teach. A mathematician who invented computers while defeating Nazis then was destroyed by the government he saved. Indigenous Alaskans who defended America with ancestral knowledge then were denied the benefits they'd earned. Black soldiers who kept armies rolling with 20-hour shifts then went home to segregation. Baseball legends who traded fame for fighter cockpits because their country asked. A Hollywood actress who invented Wi-Fi between film shoots then died, broke, and forgotten. A secret city of 82,000 building apocalypse weapons without knowing it. A president who fought an undeclared war to save democracy by bending its rules. 2 nations that never formally ended their war 79 years later. And Nazi rockets that became the Saturn V moral complications we still haven't resolved. These aren't the stories you learned in school. They're the stories that actually explain how World War II shaped the modern world for better and worse, in triumph and tragedy, with heroes who were forgotten and villains who were forgiven. History is complicated. These 9 facts prove it. Now you know what every history buff should know. The real story is always stranger, darker, and more human than the mythology we prefer.